The Montreal Screwjob will never go away. This is a story that will live on in infamy. No one will forget about this. Vice decided to produce a documentary about the Montreal Screwjob in their Dark Side of the Ring series. And we start off this documentary with Bret Hart and his home in Calgary. We hear from him. He's going to be on this. But the more people I see are featured right now early in the documentary are Jim Cornette and Bruce Pritchard. You also have Eric Bischoff there. And you have Scott Hall, which is an odd choice. I don't know what really Scott Hall had to do with the screw job, but he's on here too. You have a lot of talk about the build-up of Bret the Hitman Hart. You hear about Stu Hart, the Hart family, and the Dungeon, Stampede Wrestling in Calgary. Then when Bret goes to the WWF, he's teamed with Jim Danville Neidhart. They have the Hart Foundation, and then he becomes a single star. He defeats Ric Flair, which at the time was said more so to do with Flair's contract than Bret. And they skimmed over this too, obviously. But this is during the steroid trial, so I think one of the main reasons Bret got the belt is because he was smaller. Everyone else was a fucking giant at that time. But this was right in the middle of the steroid trial. Goes to Bret. And then we hear about WCW. Eric Bischoff gets in the documentary. He talks about how in WCW he was so much smaller than the WWF. So one of the things he wanted to do was, because WWF was very cartoony, it was geared towards children, he wanted to have more of a reality-based wrestling show and gear it towards adults. He used real names. Instead of Razor Ramon, he had Scott Hall. Instead of Diesel, you have Kevin Nash. And they talk a lot about the curtain call, which the curtain call happened in 96, I believe. It was Scott Hall and Kevin Nash's last night, and they were both very good friends with Triple H and Shawn Michaels. And in New York City, in Madison Square Garden, they all went to the ring, they hugged, and there was still a steel cage down. And it was shocking because the fans were stunned because they had never broken kayfabe. And that, it's a good prelude to the Montreal Screwjob because that's the beginning of the curtain starting to be pulled back. And that, of course, led to more reality-based wrestling. You had the Attitude Era, you had WCW, which literally broke kayfabe every single night. And this is where things became more real in wrestling. We hear a lot about the tension that's building up between Bret and Shawn. There was Bret ripping Shawn Michaels for posing for a Playgirl, which is basically the female version of Playboy. It's Playboy for women. And then you had Shawn Michaels go very far, in which he basically makes a comment on Raw about Bret having sunny days, which basically is saying Bret's having an affair with Sunny, who's Tammy Sitch. And that was infuriated Bret because he had to explain that to his wife, and that became a big story too, and Bret really hated Shawn for that. Then they have that brawl backstage during Raw, and Bret rips off a part of Shawn's hair. Shawn flips out, and this is where Shawn starts to threaten to go to WCW. He wanted to go there because Kevin Nash and Scott Hall were there. And there's, problems start to really arise right now. And WWF at this time is getting their ass handed to them in the ratings. NWO's huge. Hogan is drawing huge in WCW. They have so many big stars there. WCW is kicking WWF's ass in 97. So for me watching this, it's not too interesting because I know everything. I mean, I've heard about the Montreal Screwjob for years. Bret and Shawn hate each other. Shawn's a complete prick in the 90s. He's being an asshole to Bret. Bret even has tried many times to bury the hatchet with Shawn back then, and Shawn's just this idiot. He's just a pain in the ass, and Bret's gone to the point he's felt so disrespected by Shawn, he's not going to put him over. And this is where we have the huge mess. So we're now at the Survivor Series. They're talking about that night, and we're introduced to the referee of the match, Earl Hebner. I've seen Earl do about 2 million interviews about the Montreal Screwjob, so he's not going to say anything I haven't already heard. So they show a part where Bret Hart and Earl Hebner talked on the plane the night before, and Bret's fully expecting to be screwed. And now we hear from Wrestling with Shadows. Bret was mic'd that night, and you can hear his conversation with Vince. I really enjoyed that documentary, by the way. It's probably my favorite wrestling documentary I've ever seen, Wrestling with Shadows. It's really, really good. So they show Earl Hebner when he was walking to the ring. Jerry Briscoe pulls him aside and tells him you have to screw Bret. When Shawn has the sharpshooter, ring the bell. That's how the match is going to end. And Hebner knows he needs a job there, so his decision's pretty easy there at that point. And he even tells his brother, his twin brother, Brian, I don't even remember his name. They basically load up all their luggage in the car where they were driving, and as soon as the match ends, he's going to sprint out of the arena and get the hell out of Montreal. Smart move. So match starts, Bret versus Shawn, title at Survivor Series 97. So in the match, it's about 10-15 minutes. It's not a very long match at all. It's a far cry from their WrestleMania 12 60-minute Iron Man match, but here they had a lot of brawling. It wasn't really a great match. You expect, Bret and Shawn, they'd have this great match. It wasn't like that at all. It's pretty much a brawl for a long time, and eventually Shawn gets Bret in the sharpshooter, and Bret even tells the story of when he's in the position of the sharpshooter, because his back is turned and he's on the ground. He can see Vince through the middle rope, and he can see Vince yelling at the timekeeper, ring the bell, ring the fucking bell, ring the bell. And Bret just knows that he's being screwed right there. And eventually the bell rings. Earl Hebner calls for it, and Earl Hebner runs out of the ring. Bret gets really mad. Once he gets up, he spits. It's disgusting. He spits right in Vince McMahon's hair, and he's flipping out. He's swearing, and he even writes WCW with his hand. He has a hand motion, and he's able to do WCW. Shawn gets right out of the ring. Him and Hunter, who was there in China, all get out. Bret is just flipping out. He just smashes $1,000 security cameras, just destroying shit. F-bombs. Owen Hart and Davey Boy Smith, the British Bulldog, are there. They're trying to console him. He's just furious. It's all chaos. It's the most shocking outcome ever to a wrestling match because of how it had happened. So its legacy still lives to this day. Jim Cornette's telling a story of him and Vince Russo at Vince McMahon's place. I wasn't expecting Vince Russo to be a part of this documentary, but him and Cornette are telling the story of how they went over all the finishes for the match. Nothing would work. They knew Bret wouldn't lose to Shawn, and Bret kept shooting them down, so it was a huge problem. So Jim Cornette says he's the one who came up with the idea to double-cross him, and for a while this becomes Jim Cornette versus Vince Russo in this Montreal Screwjob documentary. They really hate each other, but Cornette reveals he's the one who said to double-cross him. So I have to say, Jim Cornette's doing really good on this documentary. He's telling the story of him and Russo, and both of them are taking credit for it. Cornette saying he's the one who pitched the idea of Shawn to put Bret in the sharpshooter and double cross him, because Cornette remembers a story that happened in wrestling back in the 1930s in Montreal, by the way, of when there was a wrestler who was champ and had to get the belt off him. So what they had was the other wrestler, they had someone bite him in the back and have blood on his chest. So when he took him down, it looked like that the champion had bit him, and because of that there was a disqualification and they got the belt off him. Here with Cornette, he's the one who claims he pitched it. Now Russo is also saying he pitched it. Russo is saying I had told Vince to have Shawn put Bret in a sharpshooter, and then Russo, his idea is that's going to cause the referee to stop the match and Shawn gets the belt. That's Russo's idea of screwing them. So both of them are going back and forth. This is really entertaining, by the way, and you can tell these two absolutely fucking despise each other. I mean, Jim Cornette really hates Vince Russo. And Cornette's even telling a story of when he's watching in the back, he knew, holy shit, they're actually going to do this. And he runs out of the building, and he even tells the story of when he was leaving the parking lot, he saw these headlights come up from behind him, and now it makes sense. It was probably Earl Hebner who also ran out of the building. So there's chaos once they get back to the dressing room. Shawn's completely denying it. He's saying he never did it. They even show a part where Shawn throws the belt because he's so mad. Shawn's in on this. Bret even tells the story of Undertaker being really mad. I've never really known how Undertaker reacted to the Montreal Screwjob because they're so secretive of his character. And even on that Wrestling with Shadows, I know they weren't allowed to film the Undertaker, but Undertaker's so mad. Bret tells the story of Undertaker kicking down the huge giant barrel. He's going to Vince's office to yell at him to make him apologize and stuff. Bret is he's in the shower, and Vincent comes in the dressing room, and Bret tells him, "Get the fuck out of my dressing room, or else I'm gonna punch you out." And Bret goes, he finishes his shower, and he gets dressed, and he even tells the story of when he's tying his last shoelace, he realizes, "Holy shit, I'm gonna punch Vince McMahon out." And what he does is he tells the story of grabbing Vince like it's a professional wrestling, how you grab him by the head, and he pulls back. He says his whole body, he just crushes Vince with this most vicious uppercut you'll ever see, knocks Vince off his feet. Vince is out cold. The wrestlers are going nuts. Bret leaves the room. There's just silence. It's crazy. He even tells the story of Shawn Michaels crying, and Shawn was expecting Bret to fight him. It's insane even to this day, thinking how crazy it was 22 years ago. But he knocks Vince McMahon out cold. So we get to the aftermath, the night after. I remember hearing a story, they didn't cover it, but Mick Foley wouldn't go back to work. He was so mad. They said Undertaker was really mad. I'm sure all the guys were fuming. It was a total shit show. They didn't mention Triple H. It kind of protected him, but he had some involvement in it too. And for a lot of years, Bret Hart hated Triple H. It wasn't too long ago when he rated his match with The Undertaker at WrestleMania a 4 out of 10, which was really funny. But the aftermath is Cornette, again, he's the star of this documentary, does really good. But he's talking about how, Vince McMahon is able to use this and becomes a heel because the fans hate him for this. Shawn becomes a top heel, and Bret becomes the hottest star in wrestling, and WCW dropped the ball. And it was also shocking to them because they thought Bret would be the one guy who would never expose the business. And he did. He went on Michael Landsberg, every single, Canadian wrestling show, TSN. He exposed the business for what it was, which was scripted. And that was also really surprising, too. And they had Vince retaliate. He did an interview with Jim Ross on Raw. So this is, again, even to this day, this is one of the stories I really wish the internet was. Could you imagine if the Montreal Screwjob happened in the age of wrestling Twitter? Man, it would have just been nuts. As they reflect on it back to this day, you have Eric Bischoff, who he talks about how Bret just didn't work in WCW, and he says things could have been worked better, but he thinks Bret had a bad attitude there, and he thinks the thing was real. Scott Hall, he thinks just Bret didn't get over in WCW, and that's because of how they used him. They used him horribly. And he believes that the Montreal Screwjob is a work. I knew he was going to say that before this documentary heard because I read it. But when I think back, it's like, the things he's saying, he says, he doesn't mention wrestling with shadows, but he says Bret doesn't look shocked, which is explained because Bret Hart has already said he was expecting to be screwed. He's pissed off more than he's shocked. He's also saying how the spit, the truck, why did it go right into Vince? That's fair. That's fair because, whenever something crazy happens. Look at Bret Hart at the Hall of Fame a couple weeks ago. This is an example. The TV truck, immediately cuts the block. They show the crowd. That's an example of when something crazy and unexpected happens. So that's fair, but I think for sure it was real. So Jim Cornette pretty much shuts down Scott Hall. He's furious at him. I think Bruce Pritchard made it quickly. I think sometimes people go to conspiracy theories to make a story because they become so obsessed with the story and they're so intrigued by it. They want more of a story, so they add their own story to something that's just not true. And I think that's what you had with the Montreal Screwjob. There was more of a story created by fans and conspiracy theorists than there actually was one. I thought the documentary ended up being pretty good. I think if you ever want to watch a really good one, just watch Wrestling with Shadows. But this was fun to hear for some of the wrestlers talk about this even till this day, even though if you're sick of hearing it, which I am. I thought it was good. It ends with Vince Russo and Jim Cornette going back and forth, which kind of supposed to be more about Bret Hart. But Vince Russo, he doesn't say much, but Jim Cornette just ignores him, and Cornette says, I will live long enough, I will outlive Vince Russo, I will live long enough to piss on his grave, and I'll have a picture of my gravestone next to my gravestone of me pissing on his grave. That's how much he hates Vince Russo. So I thought the documentary was good. I thought it was entertaining. It was well done. There wasn't too much bullshit. I didn't want them to start talking about Bret Hart walking on WCW with the title like Medusa. That was never going to happen because of the contract. She was still under contract for 3 more weeks, but I didn't have to worry much about that. I thought it was good. I thought it was a good documentary. I enjoyed it. But I have to say, if this is the last I ever hear about the Montreal Screwjob, I will be happy.